right. Well, welcome to all you truth seekers and spiritual wanderers out there. The question tonight is, did I just welcome the same people? Or are there truth seekers and spiritual wanderers? We're talking about whether you can be spiritual but not religious. And if you graduate from here, which I'm hoping most of you will one day, there is a 40% chance in America that you will identify as spiritual but not religious. And that has grown by 10 percentage points about every decade for the last 3 decades. So this is a trend that's happening. And so Veritas was really smart to bring this up as a group. For us to have these conversations. Because I think some of us think, okay, is religion mostly about being right and what's going on in truth, in dogmas and rules? Or is it something that's spiritual, that's something about the heart and about emotion? Like, where is the truth in that? But I think one interesting part is so many of us will hear terms like orthodox. And orthodox goes back to ortho is rightly aligned, so your orthodontist is rightly aligned teeth. That's who straighten your teeth. Orthodox is often translated as right belief, like alignment with truth. But the word in Greek, that second part, rightly aligned second dox, means both truth, belief, and glory, and worship. It means something like that, something that we would say is both spiritual and religious. And so in many ways, I love that term orthodox because it captures both elements. And so what we're going to do tonight is try to have a conversation with 2 extraordinary people who have a rich experience in the spiritual but not religious realm and thinking about these issues within their own lives and with colleagues over the years. So we'll have a conversation and then eventually we'll have our wonderful Q&R. So let's start off by just welcoming these 2. And I'll start off with you, Tim, and I'm going to play my Oprah here. Tell me about yourself. Like, how did you end up here? How did you begin to think about the issues that are our topics today?
Well, thank you. Thanks for coming out. I grew up in a non-religious home. God was never talked about. We never went to church. My grandparents were religious, and every Christmas got us 2 presents. One, they got us a really fun, cool present. The second one was a Bible. They would just give us a Bible. We all knew it was coming. It was wrapped. It was right there. My mom would say, just say thank you. You don't have to read it, right? So I'm a reader. So one day I picked up one of my Bibles. I opened it, honest to goodness, to the part of the New Testament that said, if your right hand offends you, cut it off. I was like, we're done. I literally closed the book, threw it away. I was in martial arts. I teach self-defense at domestic violence shelters. And a guy went to my brother's high school, Michael Crane's Karate for Christ. Don't you love that? Jiu-jitsu for Jesus. I just think that's awesome. And he couldn't share the gospel, but he did karate demonstrations and came home and he said, oh, you were to love today? And I was like, oh, doggone. He goes, well, I was going to be at a church. So me and my karate friends went to this demonstration. He chopped off a watermelon with a samurai sword, did all these things. Then he talked about Jesus. I'd never heard about Jesus before. And I don't know what happened that night, but something grabbed me in a very powerful spiritual way. I had to actually walk forward. Those of you who maybe come from traditional Christian perspectives, I had to walk forward to accept Jesus. The last word I heard before I went forward was my non-Christian karate member going, no effing way, as I walked forward to accept Jesus. Then here's what happened. I knock on my door 2 days later. A pastor is canvassing, and he could have been from any church. I honestly knew nothing. And he knocks on my door, and I said, hey, I just accepted Jesus. He goes, come to my church. I said, well, sure, okay. So I went to his church all through high school, and it was one of the most damaging things that ever happened to me because it was a very legalist church. We had to read the 1611 King James Version of the Bible. You couldn't watch movies. Even if you watched Disney movies, you fell into the Hollywood machine that turned out, inappropriate things. You had to be at church every time the doors opened, so I stopped karate because you couldn't have any idols. So church was very damaging to me until I got to college, Eastern Michigan University, where I was introduced to Cru, Campus Crusade for Christ, and for the first time heard about grace, that God is a God of love and he's a God of grace, and my walk just took off. But at the same time, I'm on the debate team where we are learning to argue both sides of an issue. So when it came to things like God, truth, and religion, I could mentally argue both sides of the issue. So faith does not come easy to me. I do belong to a church now, a healthy church. I find those checks and balances to be really helpful. Having come from an experience that wasn't so great, it's great to be in an experience now where I feel like I can see the value of organized religion, even though I have great sympathy for spirituality, feeling like that's kind of how I was. Even though I didn't know about Jesus, I had this strong inclination towards God. So I'm here to see the value of spirituality for sure. My debate part will want to kick in at some part saying, is spirituality, religion just a coping mechanism, or is there actually truth? Like, is there a God out there that is not swayed by our opinion of God, but is independent, is objectively true? And that'd be kind of an interesting part to get to. So I'm glad to be here tonight.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, Elizabeth, do you want to introduce you, even though many in the audience probably know you from class or the radio?
I know, I'm looking really quickly to see if I see any of my students so I know to look at. Hi, guys. Okay, good. So it's interesting. I brought notes because I've never really sat down and thought about what my religious or, experience from my autobiography was. And Stephen said, you should be able to talk about that. I've never thought about it before, really, in the whole story, just pieces. So here's my brief takeaway. I was raised in a home with a Catholic schoolgirl mother who didn't believe in it, but made us all go to CCD. And so we all went to CCD. My mother taught our classes. And then when I was in high school, I ran the folk mass at our church because I liked singing, and there was a really cute guy that played the bass in the folk mass that I really liked. So I was doing that. And then I would be up in the choir loft on the Sunday mornings, and before Mass, we had to go down and talk to the fathers, whoever was doing Mass, and kind of say, here's the songs we're doing. And Father Glass and Father Spoonser both liked to, and so it always stunk like a lot of church wine, and they did not like folk Mass at all. And so they would say to me, you better jump in quickly, because if you don't, I'm going to start the Our Father without you. And so it became kind of this strange dichotomy of me up in the choir loft and them down on the altar, and then this kind of contest. As soon as it was time, we'd be strumming our guitars. And so at some point in that, I lost the luster for the guy who played the bass. And so then I kind of lost the luster for being at church because it didn't feel like anything to me. There was no sense of connection. And I remember going home to my mom and saying, I just don't believe in any of this, Mom. It just feels very disconnected. It feels very hateful towards women. It's 1978, 79, second wave feminism for all my students out there. And I'm getting radicalized and going, this is a very patriarchal experience, looking down on this church and who's in charge and the pictures of who's there. I don't buy it. And my mother turns to me and she goes, I don't buy it either. I was just waiting for you all to figure it out. I'm like, oh my God. That's your religious teaching? Okay. So I left and I went off to UC Santa Barbara, right in the I Found It movement. So all of my fellow UCSB students are I found doing it everywhere, and I was not finding it. I really still liked boys. So that was my religion. We'll talk about that later. But I really didn't do much. I took a religious studies class in college. I thought that was great, kind of wondering, as everyone's finding their faith and really getting involved, and inside I'm thinking, what's wrong with me? Because I don't feel anything. And I'm almost envious of my friends who are like strongly identifying with this Christianity, that they're going to these services. Like, I don't feel it. There must be something broken. So I took Native American Studies, and so I kind of delved into the indigenous practices. That felt great, but it wasn't my home. At that time, it was called Black Studies, and they sent us to Black Church downtown Santa Barbara. I loved that, but that was not my home. So there was always kind of the wandering piece. And it wasn't until I got married, or somewhere along that lines, I also, because remember it's the late 70s, now early 80s, I met a woman who had a big giant goddessy necklace on, and I said, what is that? And she told me it's the goddess Willendorf, and I go to these full moon rituals at the Coalesce bookstore, and so I said, I'll go. And it was the first time I felt something, just this deep, abiding connection to women, to the feminine, to feeling good about myself and who I was and embodied who I was. It was the moment of the change. But then there was also this feeling of a lot of mocking of the goddess spirituality or feminist spirituality, so I kind of back-pocketed it, didn't talk about it very much, but kind of kept it there throughout most of my life. I went to graduate school at Pacifica Graduate Institute, very much into mythology and Joseph Campbell and a lot of spiritual studies in that as well. And so I don't want to take forever with it, but for me there was a moment of this wanting to feel something deeper, like this faith that everyone talked about. And a lot of my cohort felt that about Jung, that he was their Jesus, and I didn't feel that. And then my friends that were deeply religious had that faith, I didn't have that. But one of my teachers finally was talking about faith, and that's why I had to write it down, that faith itself is not a fixed religious belief. It's not attached to a fixed religious belief. It's actually a universal feature of the human experience, that all of us seek that sense of faith in some way, and that the faith itself is not separate from our life, but it's actually the orientation of who we are in our thoughts and our beliefs and our actions and our feelings, and it's expressed through the acts of our daily living. And I went, oh, so actually, I'm already spiritual in the acts of my daily living because I chose my mate and chose to have children and raise that family, and I'm very deeply connected to the care of others in the earth, and water, which I mentioned in my bio, and music that moves me. And with this understanding that my faith is the spiritual practices of my life that I already live, that's when things came together. And I really understood that my spirituality, my faith, is the intentions of the choices I make. The sacredness of being a mother, the sacredness of being a wife, the sacredness of being in the water, those fill me. And that's my answer to your question, Stephen Lloyd Moffat.
Thanks. I've been fortunate enough to be on Elizabeth's show a lot, so she has asked me so many questions over the years on the air. I feel like I'm finally getting my vengeance.
You did. Sweaty,
to me to get to ask the questions. So, but I'm curious, Elizabeth, was there a moment where you ever identified as the spiritual but not religious? Is that a term you ever used?
So here's what's interesting. I would almost, before this, would have been embarrassed to say that I'm spiritual because I always attach that to action. Like when I think of someone who says they're spiritual, I think they're doing ohms and yoga and praying, and I do none of those things. And so I felt like that would be disingenuous. I could never call myself spiritual.
So that meant something else. Actually, and Tim, I'm wondering with you, you had that experience in high school, and you stepped away from that. Were you ever like, okay, I like the spiritual parts of Christianity, I just can't stand the church part? I mean, because that's kind of where some people are going with spiritual but not religious. Like, I love the Jesus, hate the Jesus follower type feeling.
Yeah, I had that weird push and pull. Like after I started going to this church, after I embraced Christ as my Savior, I was very much interested in God and Jesus, but there was just rule after rule after rule after rule, and I just felt guilt-ridden when I couldn't match No, I had nothing to compare that to. So I just thought this is what Christianity is. You have to be in church twice on Sunday, Monday, and Wednesday, and if you didn't, you were putting something ahead of God. So there was this pull towards God, but I found that the additional rules that were being placed upon me ultimately, I think were kind of stifling of who God wanted me to be, and I didn't realize it until I actually got to college and saw how a healthy church can serve as checks and balances and provide a time-tested path for us to walk on.
Yeah.
And I find that, for me, is very helpful, the checks and balances.
Did you ever sort of I can say when I first came to Cal Poly, I would ask the students, in their opening essay, what role has religion played in your life? And I remember one of the first answers I got said, religion has played no role in my life, I'm a Christian. and I was like, wow, these students are not very bright. And then I came to learn what they meant by that.
Yeah.
That for them, religion is the rules part. And why they wouldn't necessarily create the dichotomy with the opposite of religion is spirituality. Oftentimes, especially then, and maybe shift a little bit, it's like the opposite of religion is relationship. But did you ever in your mind sort of create that dichotomy that there's the religion part of Christianity and the spiritual part? Or do you think that kind of division is something that's new? And then we'll get to you, Elizabeth. Let me go here.
So I think it's kind of referring to unhealthy church, healthy church.
So that's the terminology you would use.
Yeah, that's what I would use based on my own experience. Healthy church, it gives you spiritual practices that have been time tested, right? From the New Testament, we get fasting, prayer, solitude, meditation, worship. But a church helps me facilitate that. And what I like about the church is it asks me to do things I wouldn't be inclined to do, but are good for me. Okay. I get a little concerned when my students want to self-select the things that are, I want that from Buddhism, I just don't want the radical simplicity of the Buddha. I want this from Christianity, but I don't want deny yourself, pick up the cross and follow me. So maybe it's me, but I don't trust myself to always know what's best for me. And a church can provide that structure. And I suspect a spiritual community could do the same. I absolutely.
Yeah, Elizabeth, have you thought, has there been times in your life that you're like, I don't like religion, but I am drawn to spirituality?
So I would say what I love about religion is that I love the traditions. I love the rituals. I love the symbolism. I like having the organized piece of here is how we behave and stand and sit, and I like that piece of it. That actually felt important. So that's the piece that I take into my spiritual life, is I create lots of rituals in my life that I follow that give it kind of this feeling of structure and these feelings of groundedness. So I like that piece. Yeah. For me, the religious organization was the community. And what I didn't mention is that I raised my girls, I kind of did what my mom did. I raised my girls in the Unitarian Universalist Church because I wanted them to have some sort of background, not zero. And I wanted them to have some education. I think that's really important to have a full religious education so that you can understand what resonates. So we did participate in that, and I liked the community of the people. But the actual, again, that kind of emptiness of that lacked the ritual. It's like one of the ironic parts about the UU is it's so free and open, it felt there was no ritual or spiritualness to it to me at all. I liked the incense.
Now, one of the, smells and bells. Okay.
And chants.
And chants, yeah. So, one of the things I really appreciate in getting to talk to Elizabeth is she talks to students all the time about, what they're going through, and people get quite open in her classes. What do you think, in talking with our students, is the draw of this spiritual but not religious? Like, why is that the trend?
Well, it goes back a little bit to what I said. A lot of what the students will come and say to me is, I want to believe deeply in something. I feel like I don't know how to find it. And I want to have something that's not old, right? that feels old and unrelatable. And because a lot of my students know, because I talk a lot about the feminist piece of it, they go, I don't want something that's the patriarchy. I don't want a bunch of old men telling me how to feel close to God, and so how do I find that? Because if I talk about feminine energies or the goddess thing, that also gets mocked. So where is my place? Yeah. I don't want to be an old church. I want to feel this good stuff, but it in some ways feels too wooey. And so they're stuck between the wooey and the old and trying to find that middle space.
Yeah, trying to find that
Do you
space.
Find that too?
Yeah, I think there is, they don't see the deep connection to some of the past things. I think I often see too, especially in America, religion equals evangelical equals Republican, and there is a kind of a let's step back, especially among young people, that I don't want those connotations. I mean, I say, you know, people say I'm not religious, I'm Christian, and what I've heard more recently is don't call me a Christian, I'm a Jesus lover, because Christian has been tainted for them, for many of them. So I do sort of see that, but where I think the link is they want something personal.
Yes.
They want something that fits for them. And this is where I think it's interesting, Tim, like your point is, when does spiritual but not religious become just spiritual egoism? Like I just want something for me, and I'm the arbitrator of what is of what should be.
Yeah, can I quick about the old? C.S. Lewis, one of my favorite Christian writers, calls it chronological snobbery. I don't think new is better, per se. I think today we look at our society, we're a little bit of a mess. And I think some of the old rhythms should not be discounted simply because of tradition. We both have connected over Seneca Falls. So I teach a class on gender, I teach a class on feminism. I would for sure identify as a Christian feminist. But just because truth came at a particular time in history doesn't necessarily, in my tradition, don't read into that the fact that God was incarnated as a man, somehow privileging manhood over womanhood. I don't think that's the case in the Christian tradition. The Song of Solomon is probably the most radical book in ancient literature where women have 60% of the voice talking about sexuality. Right? So I cringe just a little bit at let's not just assume new is better. It can be in some ways, and I think we have progressed in some really healthy ways. And then let me just comment on this. One of the biggest mistakes we've made, I would say I'm an evangelical, and then take a deep breath. I think there's been some mistakes made of aligning ourselves with political power in ways that I don't think necessarily serve Jesus very well. So for me, it's weird, Stephen. It is about Jesus. Fundamentally, it is a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, but that has to be mediated, right? And I find a church to be helpful because I don't know if I trust myself. Some call it buffet spirituality, which we know from obesity studies that the problem with buffets are that I walk through the buffet and take everything I like and maybe ignore the things that might be really good for me. I'm a little fearful if we say spirituality is I'm mixing and matching from certain religions, but there's no overall structure to say, yeah, but when taking from Buddhism, make sure you take, right, all of the Eightfold Path and not just parts of that you like. So I'm a little concerned that people have a propensity to say, this is what I'm going to take. I like this, but I'm going to skip the really hard parts.
Yeah.
At least I'd feel that tension if I was doing that.
Yeah, and I mean, let's jump on that because I think one of the elements of Elizabeth's story is feeling at home at a spot, and I think there's sometimes a pressure that people feel to be like, okay, I was raised in the Catholic Church. I've got to. This is my path or whatever church or synagogue that you find yourself in, and yet you just don't feel it, and so then you end up faking it. You end up being like, I know what I'm supposed to do. And Elizabeth, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but how do you think, how much of this buffet spirituality, which I think is part of it, is just the search to feel at home at a spot?
So I just have to ask Tim because I'm so curious. What is it that happens to you if you do go to the buffet and choose incorrectly? Are you going to get spited or turned to salt? I guess that's the thing I'm curious. Is like, right. You talk about being concerned, but what is the concern? That's my question. It's like, what is the overarching punishment you'll get if you eat the tapioca pudding instead of the kale?
Well, so the metaphor. Let's move away from the metaphor. We both care about marriage, right?
Yes.
Yes. So we know that when it comes to making marriage work, you guys do some really hard things.
Yes.
So it could be in my marriage, I'm here mostly for me. I want my needs met. I want to be fulfilled.
Totally fair.
If that means I have to die to self in this marriage, then I don't want to do that. I'd rather hang on to my bitterness, anger, resentment. So I'm going to find a new marriage because I don't want to do the hard things to make this marriage work. I think, is it fair to say that every major religion would have both things that you would find pleasurable and you would find things that would be very difficult? I mean, I'm thinking of Islam, the 5 pillars of Islam. There are some hard practices that I think eventually a Muslim would say leads me to freedom. So, well, we know from the buffet thing, you literally are going to become obese by only camping out on the things that I think are good if you're just overindulging on the good things without making sure that you have a balanced diet. I think what religion does for me is it gives me a balanced diet, even the things that I wouldn't necessarily take myself. And I do think a spiritual community can do that. I don't want to say it can't, but it doesn't seem as organized as a church that meets regularly and pushes each other, confess our sins to each other. But I do think a spiritual community could do that.
Yeah,
I'm just going to answer, and then I'll give it back to you.
Yeah.
Because the moderator and me is jumping out. Because, yes, I'm so glad you brought up the marriage as an example. Because as I said at the beginning, when I look at my spiritual practices, my marriage is one of my spiritual practices.
Yeah.
If you look at John Gottman's work, he wrote a whole thing on marriage as a path to spiritual wholeness and how we can find our way through that work with another person. And it's about making hard decisions. So I get that, and making a commitment to something and putting aside all others for that. Like, I 100% get that. It resonates with me in a deep way. But I also, the question was, but if I were to do it incorrectly, what's the punishment? And yours was, well, you end up getting divorced. But it seems like with the religious thing, I don't know where I'm going to go with that, but it feels like more of I have to do the hard things, or what happens was my question.
Yeah.
Do you go to hell? Is that what we're talking about?
Well, and I think on that, what's fascinating is there's both the short-term practical elements, because I think Elizabeth...
Are you telling me what that word was you said?
What's that?
The short term.
In the short term, there's the practical parts of it.
Sorry, okay.
Because I think in some part what we're seeing is, Elizabeth, you're saying, I needed to trust myself where I'm at home. And if my home is tapioca pudding and fried chicken,
let's go marriage.
That's it.
Let's stick with the marriage.
Okay, or
I'm
marriage,
feeling really
right?
anxious about all the fat-shaming comments about food.
No, I'm not saying in that sort of way. I'm not saying that sort of way. I'm just saying an obscure food items together, right? But that should be good. And I think what I hear Tim saying is, I don't trust myself, and so I need to be forced into a line sometimes.
Yeah,
and that it sounds like, Tim, you're saying the fear is that it won't be spiritual in a productive and developmental way, hopefully in alignment with truth, but it will be spiritual egoism. That I will just take what's easy and feels good, and there's got to be some path that is more than just a spiritual hedonism. Is that fair?
Yeah, and I would say, I'm very quickly running these through my head. For sure, Christianity would say that something has entered the human condition that in some way has compromised us. For sure, that's Islam. For sure, that would be Buddhism. For sure, that would be Hinduism. But let me tell you what concerns me. I have a really dear friend of mine who I love to death, an adult convert to Buddhism. So we've had these amazing conversations over time. And I said to her, well, what do you do with bad karma? How do you live your life? Here's literally what she said. Oh, I don't do bad karma. I only believe in good karma. And I was like, did you write the Home Office to get approval for that? You know what? That's the thing that concerns me. And so in Christianity, I don't completely trust my desires, because I have both good desires for sure, but I also have desires that aren't good. And I can't think of one discipline, my PhD, doing a black belt in Kung Fu. I had to do the things that were really hard and didn't want to do, and a community encouraged me to do it, to ultimately get to the place that I really wanted to get to.
Yeah. Elizabeth, I have another question unless you want to jump in there.
No, I could, but I'll let you go.
Okay. So, there's another aspect of this that I think you're really good at. You're really thoughtful on. And that is that there is something liberating about saying, I don't have to stick to the entire menu of Catholicism if it doesn't speak to me. And there's been, countless generations of Catholics who, I don't mean to pick on Catholics, but, who Catholic guilt is what kept me going, or Hindu guilt, or, there's a lot of cultures that have worked off shame and guilt. And so I can appreciate the liberating, but I think also there's an aspect that we've talked about before about freedom also can be a burden, because this is not just choosing, iPhone or Google phone, right? This is something that matters. And so there's so many options out there. You've got all these impulses. You've got grandparents saying one thing, you've got your friends saying another, you've got culture saying another, that in some ways this move to being spiritual could create anxiety, because there's just so many aspects of your life that you have to fit together. I mean, maybe the analogy is something like, it would be great for us all to bake real fancy cakes and figure out how to do that. But, just going to Madonna Inn, I get something good. I know how it turns out, right?
It's interesting because because my profession is in psychotherapy, and so I think a lot of this for me is about the existential questions of what is the meaning of life, and that existential vacuum. And most mental health issues arise from those existential questions of what is my purpose, what is the meaning of life. And so that brings a lot of people into therapy. And then it's in many ways substituted for the old religious stories of what is my meaning and purpose in life, and God tells me that, or I read the Bible and it gives me guidelines. A lot of people come to therapy and hope their therapist will be their guru and give them guidelines. But for me, like the overarching piece is we're all on this path to fill that existential vacuum. What is our meaning? What is our purpose? And so I find it for myself, it's a little more tangible. It's like solid things of, your meaning and purpose. And this is engendered for those who give birth. But once you make children, I don't have a lot of anxiety or doubt or worries about my purpose of being on the planet. I think that's kind of a masculine thing in some ways, because I know what I'm doing here. Right. And so that searching for that meaning and purpose, I think spirituality feeds that a little bit, because it's a grander prospect of how we define meaning and purpose. It can be in looking at relationships and raising people and caring and having that as being really solid cornerstones to our mental health and well-being. Because I would argue that a lot of the desire to feel religious is the desire to fill that existential vacuum, to feel like there's a plan and someone's telling me how to live, and that serves that. But I think that can also be fed and served through the other philosophical work.
Yeah, and I mean, we've known each other long enough that you do just radiate in those roles, being a mother and being a caregiver, and that's
emotion
it.
Worker.
And I see that and I feel that around you. I'm wondering do you think there's an infinite number of ways to fill that meaning gap? Like, can I find it by, standing on my head on a surfboard?
I don't.
Or you don't think there's an infinite number?
No.
And is there a hierarchy?
Because there has to be some substance to the meaning, or it's not going to be long-standing, right? The meaning to your life, that existential fulfillment, has to be something grounded in something purposeful, so that you wake up and you go, no matter how horrible my life is, no matter what trauma I've been through, I have to get up because I'm responsible for this or these people, and that gets me going and moving. It's bigger than myself. And that's the whole quest for feeling spiritual religious. I want to feel like I'm a part of something bigger than myself. And so I see that as being, yes, you can feel God on the surfboard for sure. You can feel God at a Grateful Dead show. I have. And I was not on drugs. So yes, you can feel them, but I think the real solid, the part that Tim would say is that to commit yourself to something, it has to be rooted in something deeper than kind of the flash. Would that be?
Yeah, well, and Tim, I mean, in the conversations we've had, you've highlighted your Buddhist friend, the Muslim that you went on the trip with, that in many ways, you know, and so I'm wondering, how do you think that gap gets filled if we start with Elizabeth's
My theory.
theory?
So I would want to know, what gap are we talking about? The existential angst we all feel for status.
The fear of death.
The fear of
The
death.
fear of existential isolation
Yep.
and meaninglessness.
And then I would add, Pascal, that there is a God-shaped hole in the human heart that every human being experiences. Now, I'm not assuming that's the Christian God, but I do think it doesn't take much to look at human history to know. And you've actually, I heard you say this once, that the God question is the big one we've wrestled with since the beginning. And that's curious to me. Is God reaching out to us? If so, how? And let me just make one quick comment about Christians. So Biola stands for Bible Institute of Los Angeles.
I did not know that till tonight.
Yes, we learned that at dinner. So I get students who are just, there is no question it's Christianity. That's it. My parents were Christians. They basically said to me, I'll pay for school, but you got to pick a conservative Christian university. They're at Biola. I go after those students all the time. I said, you've got to own your faith. Why? Why Christianity? Why not Buddhism, which is older? Why not something as established as Islam? Why not spirituality? You own your faith, and then you come back and tell me, okay, after reading a bit more broadly and exposing ourselves to different experiences, why did you come back to Christianity? Why is it that Christianity meets both the head and the heart? I'm a little bit concerned when we talk about spirituality and use language like, well, this speaks to me. I'm a little uncomfortable with that. If there is a God, I want to know who that God is. And if there's a God, then my perception doesn't alter that deity. My preferences don't impact if there is a God. Now, I'm willing to...
And of course, we might wonder what she thinks.
Right, of course, of course. But that's
Thank you
the
for the
debate
nod.
side of me coming out a little bit, like, what criteria would we even use to answer those kind of questions?
Yeah. Well, and I'm wondering if, because I mean, there's this agreement that you both, you might use different vocabulary, but both think there's a hole in our heart that we're trying to fill.
Yes.
And we're both talking about what fills that. And I'm wondering how much of this discussion comes down to how broad of character fits in that. You know, is it, hey, because I mean, I think Elizabeth's saying, I discovered that thing that fits the hole. It wasn't that old guy on the Sistine Chapel, but it was something that was doing that. And as we've talked to him, you were like, I've found it in Jesus, and I wonder whether the Jew praying to her God is the same. I mean, is God big enough to carry us both, or is it? I mean, is that part of the question for you?
Yes. So I just got back from Israel on February 1st. 15 scholars, activists went to Israel by a group called Bridging the Gap. We actually went to a kibbutz that was attacked on October 7th. And they asked us, it was very moving to see the devastation. They asked me to pray as a Christian. They asked Saad to pray as a Muslim and Rabbi Ben to pray as a rabbi. We all did. It was very powerful, very emotional. But Stephen, I just kind of, here's the debate side of me. 3 prayers went up. Is God big enough to entertain all 3? Sure. But I guess I don't want to get rid of the law of non-contradiction completely when it comes to something as important as religion. I don't think Muhammad and Jesus would both say, yeah, you're good. You're both okay. It was the intent that mattered. I actually want to try to get at, has God revealed himself? If so, what criteria would we use to determine that he, she, they reached out to us? And I can certainly share my perspective. But let me just say this, man, parenting is sacred.
Yes, it
My
is.
marriage is sacred.
Yes,
and
it
I
is.
think I experienced God, probably one of the most profound experiences when my first son was born, and you hold that baby in your arms. I absolutely believe that's a sacred moment that God was fully communicating to me when I took my wedding vows, when, all these different things. I believe in sacred moments for sure that are God's signals to us to say, hey, but this is again using Lewis, but it wasn't the baby per se, it was God speaking through my son to the deepest part of my heart, trying to communicate to me through the beauty of birth.
Yeah. We're going to pivot here in just a minute to the Q&R. And so if you did the is that called a Q&R code? Is that the same word?
Code.
QR code, does it stand for question and response? I have no idea what that thing is, but if you did your magic with that, feel free to pull out your phones and start asking questions, and I'll see them here. And we'll do that in about 5 minutes. I'm wondering because there's this underlying element, because when I talk to a lot of students, the draw to spiritual but not religious is closely tied to an instinct to be tolerant. If there's one shared belief among California students is that we should be tolerant of others. I see that all the time.
Because what if you told me many times there are more religious
Yeah.
organizations in the state of California
Yeah.
than anywhere in the world?
Yeah.
So you better be tolerant.
Yeah, well, California is the most religiously diverse place the planet has ever known. But I think part of the issue with the critique of California generally is Californians, we are just too tolerant for everybody else in America. Like we don't hold on to things. And partly what we've been dancing around is how tolerant are we of what can fill that gap. So here's where I want to prompt on it is, we are tolerant, but if tolerance means my spirituality involves pedophilia while sacrificing chickens in front of a Nazi flag, everybody's like, no, that's not okay, right? So we all agree that there are limits, and I'm wondering how much of our conversation is how broad are those limits?
Even when I saw that question before, I hope Stephen doesn't ask that question, because it's one of those things that we grapple with so often is, how far do I bend myself to accommodate other people? And at what point do I say, this doesn't work for me, and I politely walk away? And so from a clinician standpoint, I'm all about hey, if this is not something that's going to be a healthy conversation, you politely excuse yourself and walked away, because there are going to be many times in your life that you're not going to find common ground. And I feel like we spend a little bit too much time in a really progressive way trying to find common ground and get people to come to the table, that ends up people won't agree, but they'll become silent and they'll walk away feeling more ruffled. And so that might not be the popular answer, but I feel like there's a lot of places in the world that our time and energy is needed, and to put a lot of time and energy into trying to find common ground or be tolerant.
And I think there's an underlying fear, maybe less so now than maybe in previous generations, that it just might have eternal consequences.
Right.
It might. And so I want to be tolerant, but,
So let me just say, there's social tolerance, which we need to have. The poor do not care if you're spiritual, religious, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist. The poor don't care. They need help. The marginalized in our world need help, and whatever motivates you to help them, God bless you. It does not matter to me what motivates you to help other people. But there's an intellectual tolerance that makes me feel uncomfortable. I'm willing to say that anything can motivate you to love neighbor and to love yourself, but I have higher hopes for religion, that we can intellectually think about, like the correspondence theory to truth is one that I hold to, generally speaking. Something is true if it meets the facts. And so I want to know what kind of facts could we present to spirituality and religion is put your money on the table. What do you got? In my tradition, you have the person of Jesus Christ. You have the incarnation. You have the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That I've experienced him personally, and I think there's historical evidence for the New Testament. Now, that's a debate to be had, and anybody in higher education knows that thing's been debated up, down, back around with really smart people on both sides. So I do think faith, the book of Hebrews says you can't please God without faith. I do believe it comes down to that eventually, but I don't know about intellectual tolerance that I'm going to throw out the law of non-contradiction and say everything perspective is equally true ontologically. That makes me uncomfortable, and I think we've gone into a postmodernist turn that I'm uncomfortable with.
I'm gonna pivot a little bit to some of these questions because they're better than mine. So,
There you go.
if we saw somebody acting morally, would we know whether they're spiritual but not religious or religious? Is there a relationship between how you identify in this and your morality?
Don't look at me.
Oh, I will not look at you. I will not look at you.
I was like avoiding.
I do
want to say
Oh,
something.
yeah,
No, I do.
please, jump in.
I was teasing you. One of the, and this might be off topic, Stephen, so you can steer me back, but one of the things that came up when we were talking about God too, and like, is God speaking to us? One of the things that has always challenged me, so I'll ask you both, is that so much of the destruction we see in our natural world, our climate change, can be directly related to kind of this patriarchal male dominance, men know best, and here's how we do it. And a lot of religious organizations have been part of this taking of and destruction of. And then you see equivalence of the destruction of the environment also to the treatment of women and children and the diminished value of them in the world and the world's over. And so my challenge is if we're talking about God, even if we wink, wink, what would she say? There's always that underlying sense that it's a masculine thing, that there's some sitting on their chair, Lord Almighty, that's going to make it all work out. But my challenge is that the actions on the planet speak much more to really whether or not we should be religious or spiritual, because if we were truly spiritual and we held things sacred, we would not have the climate destruction we had. We would not have the murdering of women and children or women being in positions that we are. And so that's where I always get stuck, is that I cannot fall in line with a story that the outcome is what we live with today.
And I agree.
Don't say it's because we've turned away from God.
Next question. No, I'm kidding. No, so listen, this is where the distinction between spiritual and religious for me just doesn't work, and to me it's almost not necessary.
Okay.
If you take a look at the teachings of Jesus, when he dies, James is the first one to put his thoughts in writing. Okay, so now you're going to get the Cliff Notes. This is what James thinks is most important. He shocks readers by saying, here is true religion in the sight of God, caring for orphans and widows in distress. So I don't care if it's spirituality or religion, we need to care for the marginalized, which is often women and children. I mean, we know that from the state of the world.
And the environment.
And the environment, we're governors of the world. That's the book of Genesis.
We're just part of the world, actually.
What's that?
We're not the governors, we're just a species of part of the world.
In my tradition,
Okay.
we've been
Just
given a special responsibility to be governors of the earth. I don't think that's ended. I think we've shirked that responsibility for a bunch of reasons. So yeah, again, I'm back to the thing. What motivates you to serve other people, the second great commandment, neighbor love, I don't think neighbors care what's motivating you to care for them, and I think God is pleased when that happens. So I get the patriarchy thing a little bit, I get it, but I think too much is being laid at the feet of patriarchy when I just want to say, if from our tradition, this is a human situation, not a male situation, I think the human race has been equally impacted, all of us. And listen, men have done great abuse, without a doubt, but they've also done great good. I think that's fair to say But I don't want to just lay it at the feet of patriarchy. I think we all have a human condition we need to deal with.
True. But the patriarchy, though, by definition, isn't male. It's that masculine energy that we own and destroy and build and do. That's more of an energy and a mindset. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if I can
Our
jump.
feminist lecture is now going to...
Well, if I could jump from moderator to religious studies
Go.
person, I mean, I would sit there and say is, when you look at the history of all religions, you can find good and you can find bad. When you
Agreed.
look at the history of atheism, you can find good and you can find bad. So your search is driven by what you're looking for,
That fills that space.
yeah, and there's as much harm that you can find in Christianity and Judaism and Islam and Buddhism. You can also find the abolitionist spirit, the eco nuns. It's what you want to find in religion. And yes, it's absolutely correct that much of the religion, particularly in the West, was patriarchal in orientation. And yes, that has caused harm. And then we can also see good, and that's our choice to search for.
True.
And it's what we do with it. I think that matters in it. So there's a bunch of questions here about that come back to some version of, do I really have to do all the things that different religions tell me to do? Like do I have to whole scale buy something? And I think it goes a little bit back to the buffet comment, but even within the tradition, do you think that you can be a Christian who, as one person writes, I just never really bought the resurrection. I never bought, certain elements of it. Like, how do we think through this sort of, do we have to take the whole recipe, or can we pick out the parts that?
Well, so Biola University is evangelical. I think there comes a point where the answer is yes. People have believed in a spiritual resurrection, not a physical resurrection. They believe that the Bible is it's not completely inerrant. All of Christianity is a massive moniker. I mean, it's huge. But there comes a point you're no longer evangelical, in fairness. I mean, you just say, yeah, I've left that camp. I'm no longer Catholic. I've left that camp. I've moved on. So Calvin said we should reform and keep reforming. So yeah, we should speak truth to power. We should always say to a religion, are these practices, should they be continued? But again, I'm a little bit leery of, my black belt is in Shaolin Kung Fu. So you can do mixed martial arts. I actually do that now. Mixed martial arts takes a little bit of jujitsu, a little bit of boxing, fencing, whatever. But there comes a point you're no longer doing Kung Fu. And I would just be leery of wanting to change an entire religion that has kind of passed the test of time. Now, obviously, there can be excesses and things that are wrong, and that needs to be confronted. But I'm a little bit leery of wanting to change the system to benefit my preferences.
I think for me it has a lot to do with we're searching for a narrative on which to base our life. And so if that narrative of Christianity gives you the foundation for which to live your life, then you're all in on that narrative, because as my students will know, nothing is all good or all bad in life in all aspects. So I understand that. So I think maybe I'm looking at religions as more of choose your narrative, which is a narrative, but then you have to follow that story the way it's been taught, because all religions are just a story. They're just someone's narrative of how they experienced or want to teach about God. And maybe you would disagree with that as well, but I think of Matthew Fox and his creation spirituality, and it talks about this river of spiritual universal energy, and that each religion just has different ways they tap into that same right, holy, sacred energy. And so our work is to find the narrative and the story that brings us into that sense of faith and universal energy, or however you want to describe it, that fills us. But once you start enacting the story, then you need to live the story.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting worldview to say that there's this universal energy and that all religions are simply tapping in. I'm up for that possibly being true, but then my debate side kicks in.
That's
it's like,
fine.
okay, now we got to start talking about how does he know that that's true? Like, how, what is he?
Because he's Matthew Fox.
Well, there you go. Enough said.
Yeah, I mean, and this actually is brought up by a lot of students. They're saying, and some directing it towards asking you, Elizabeth, how would I know whether the spiritual choices I make are true ones?
So,
Or is that the wrong question?
I don't know, yeah, because I don't know if it's a truth piece. It's more of, again, if that existential feeling is I want to find that Chironic happiness, right? That sense of living to my highest ideals. And I find that by the purpose and the meaning and the strivings and the strengths I have. I mean, to me, it's a little philosophical of how we create. That's my narrative. I'm going through this kind of filling of these wanting to reach my highest capacities. So how will you know that it's right for yourself? It's when that sense of meaning and purpose is real and foundational, and that you don't feel, because believe me, it took me a long time being a mother and a wife in the 70s and 80s to really want to settle into this idea that my spiritual practices, my sacred, are my marriage and my children and my work, because that's not popular amongst the women who have been raised in the last few generations. So I had to really come to grips with wanting to step up and say, this fills me, it's meaning and purpose and real, and I don't waver from it. And so that's what you're all looking for, is how do I fill that space in a way that gives me meaning and purpose? Because the therapist to me wants to say, 90% of your anxiety and depression you're feeling is this uncertainty of how you're supposed to live. And you're searching for someone else to tell you when it all resides inside of you, but you have to be willing to own it.
Yeah, well, can I follow up on that? Because I do find, it's interesting that, you sit there and say, we will know that it works because it's real, and you both mentioned childbirth. I remember,
in a much stronger way,
Yeah.
Elizabeth.
I say, when I held my oldest son, he just went to the bathroom on me. So I don't think it was sacred in that moment.
But it's something
Or
that
maybe it's the same thing that turns my mic off.
But it's something that I said at dinner, maybe at the beginning too, that's tough, is that in some ways, I don't think women, right, with female identifying women, really need the religion that men quite often are searching for in the same way, because we have the capacity to give life and nurture life, and traditionally throughout history we're the ones that tend to the sick and to the dying, and so we're in the mess every day, and we get why we're here.
Okay.
But society tells us that it's not of value.
Yeah. But I think where I want to follow up on that is, I think for both of you would say, your marriage, your children, these are real things that are foundational. And Tim may connect that more to his faith in Jesus. Elizabeth may find it meaning in and of itself, but you both turn to these things. Just looking at the questions, a lot of the students are like, okay, I'm not married, I don't have children, whatever, right? Mm-hmm. And yet Elizabeth, you'll say it has to be something real as a foundational. Well, I think for a lot of people, Tay-Tay right now, or, going to a Taylor Swift concert is feeling real. How do you tell them that isn't enough to fill that hole in them?
I am not speaking against Taylor Swift. I am not.
See how I can turn the entire audience against our speakers.
Do any good if I. But I
want to preface it with
this.
So yes, it's not just the fact that I get married and had children. Those were all parts of the journey that came from the curiosity in my teens and my 20s, and yes, loving music and feeling that sense of connectedness, and yes, learning to trust myself and trusting my body and feeling, it's a lot of those steps, and that we do have to intentionally, like you're searching for God, I think you need to be searching for your mates and your people and those communities that fill you and give you a sense of belonging and purpose and meaning. And maybe you find that in a religious community, or maybe you find that in a really deep, solid group of friends. My concern is is less about whether it should be spiritual or religious. My concern is that we don't tell young people how important it is to be in relationship with other people and put those relationships above your grades and above your careers. That, to me, is where the big existential hole is for the last few generations, is that we put so much into productivity and nothing into self-actualization.
Through others. Yeah.
Okay.
There's a version of a
that's
question.
Thank you.
Yeah. There's a version of this question for you, Tim, that is
About Taylor Swift?
yeah, everything goes back to Taylor Swift. You haven't learned that. It all goes. But someone says, I had a profound experience in nature. And to me, my experience in nature seems akin to what you're saying you experienced with Jesus.
Yeah.
Am I going to hell?
Oh, gosh.
Wow.
No. No. So remember C.S. Lewis, you have a flashlight that illumines something. Lewis would say, I don't diminish the actual beam, but it's not the beam, look where it's pointing. So I would say childbirth, nature. I got to tell you, Taylor Swift, all too well, that short film she did, I show that to my students. I mean, that's one of the rawest examples of an argument. And I think what my tradition would say is absolutely enjoy relationships, enjoy status, enjoy marriage, all that, but that won't fill the God vacuum. It won't fill it, and if you put too much pressure on your marriage or nature, I think eventually we're going to have the existential God ache, and I think that's what my tradition says is you were made for God, and well, Augustine, right? Our hearts are restless till they find peace in God, and that's probably where I'd land my plane.
That's fair.
Yeah. So we're getting towards the end of this, and I think people who are struggling with this, there's part of me that says I resonate with this tradition, whether it's Christian, Jewish, Baha'i, UU, whatever. But there's part of me that says I think I could be more fulfilled by choosing my own spiritual path and sort of identifying with that. What do you want to say to those that are in midst of that struggle in their own mind? And I think this might be a good way. Either of you can start off. Yeah.
My thoughts are that, and it's a little bit stealing from you, it's important to choose something and go all in. So if it's yoga, go all in. If it's a Christian tradition, go all in. If it's a relationship, and again, it doesn't, go all in. You have to put yourself fully into something so that if it does end or doesn't work out, you're really, really sad. Because that's one of the things about marriage today and people not putting the hard work in is because they don't want to be upset or hurt or sad if the marriage stops working. And that's the whole point. If you go 100% into something, if that person dies or the relationship ends, you should be crushed. That means you were fully involved and your life force was throbbing through it. If you're going to learn to surf or you're going to go backpacking and feel the magic of nature around you, then go all in and be intentional and say to yourself, I am doing this to fill myself spiritually. I'm doing this to connect deeper to the world around me. And it's the intentions of our actions that give us this sense of solidness and grounding. If you only do half-assed movements, like I think I'll take one of these classes and I'll pretend I like this and I'll experiment with some psilocybin. That tasting part will always leave you hungry. So even if you go all in and then a year later you have to sheepishly back up and go, remember the beret thing? Not anymore. But at least you were fully into it and committed, and that's a much more rich life experience than touching little things because you're afraid that it might be the wrong choice. Go all in on some wrong choices because that's how you find where you're supposed to be. I made a lot of really wrong-ass choices before I found myself at 63 being able to really say these things to you. So I did not have this at 20 or 30 or even 40, but I went all in on each thing I did in my life, and the things that I lost were crushing, and the things that worked out have been emboldening. So that would be where I would say, don't go all in and see where it takes you. Because if that's not the right path, other doors will open. But if you're standing outside of the fire, Garth Brooks, you're never going to ever experience life in a deep and profound way.
And the only thing I would add to, well
Yes.
said, the only thing I would add to that is you're in college.
Yes.
Don't lose, so many times people graduate from college and they lose the college mentality. Right now, you're a student. Get resources, right? I love Veritas Forum. You bring together two people who have different perspectives. You get a chance to hear both. There's a mosque literally around the corner from Biola University. My students go to the mosque all the time. I mean, don't just let me talk about Islam. Go meet some Muslims who love Allah. So be inquisitive at this stage of your life and study broadly. And if, in my tradition, if God is real, the God of the Bible, you will find him, right? What does Jesus say? Those who seek me will find me. So go research and keep that kind of an attitude of don't demonize other groups, be inquisitive.
Be open.
Be open. Boy, that'll get me in trouble. Be open. But when my students finish reading the Quran, they are part of 1% of American Christians who have ever read a book of another faith tradition. That makes no sense to me whatsoever. Not as college students. We need to be thinking and praying for God's direction, but so that's why I love the Veritas Forum. Let's have that kind of attitude and continue with that inquisitiveness.